Other art of the 18th century took another direction. This art was also influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment, like rationalism, moralism, it looked back to those Greek ideas of balance and order. It was also inspired by the rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy in the mid-18th century. These were ancient Roman cities that had been buried by volcanoes, Mount Vesuvius. They were extremely well intact because they had been buried in ash and pumice, and pumice is volcanic rock. So people discovered houses, temples, and art. These were resort towns, so there was actually a lot of beautiful art and architecture that had been preserved. They found paintings in Herculaneum in Pompeii. They were frescoes, and this kind of painting had not been seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. Before this discovery, there were really no paintings that were thought to have survived from antiquity. So artists, when we look at the Renaissance, artists were actually studying sculpture more than anything else, because they didn't have these paintings to look at. Renaissance artists were also looking at ruins that were covered in dirt and vines that were not excavated. But artists of the 18th century were able to look at excavated buildings and art, and so they actually had a better view of what classic art was really like. This process begins a lot of archaeology and kind of sort of art historical discoveries because they are so well preserved. The rational and moral ideas of the Enlightenment, combined with a revival of classic art, the spread of the classical art style through the Grand Tour, intense scientific study of the world, plus a rejection of the superficialness of the Rococo style, led to the Neoclassic style. And of course, Neoclassic as a term means new classicism. Neoclassicism presents classical subject matter, either mythological or historical, in a style based on classical Greek and Roman sources. Neoclassical art usually teaches a moral lesson, but also has an emotional appeal. So in that way, it does differ from classical Greek art, that it has that emotional appeal. Maybe it's more similar to Hellenistic art. Neoclassical art was very inspired by the rediscovery of the ancient paintings that we just looked at and that you can see also in this slide, and also the architecture of Rome, or in the Roman style, so from Herculaneum and Pompeii. Neoclassicism develops in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century. A few characteristics of Neoclassicism is that it's usually simple and clear in their compositions. They use a lot of primary colors and simple color harmonies. They use saturated colors. They avoid pastels. They use dramatic contrasts of light and dark to emphasize relief and contours. And their subject matter is usually from antiquity, with uplifting moral messages and universal application. One of the foremost promoters of the neoclassic style was Johann Winckelmann, and he was alive from 1717 to 1768. He is actually known as the father of modern art history. He was German. He was a German art historian and archaeologist, and he wrote The History of Ancient Art Among the Greeks in 1764, which is a chronological account of ancient art from the Egyptians to the Etruscans. He also applied the categories of style. He showed that within a culture, art developed from the beginnings to the maturity to decline. So he's the one that kind of got the concepts going for the archaic and classic and late classic periods of the Greeks. He was devoted to Roman antiques and the knowledge of ancient art. He was able to identify Roman copies from Greek art. This is a really unusual talent for the time. He also believed that Roman art was the best art ever. He thought that that was humanity's ideal achievement. He worked closely with an artist named Anton Raphael Mengs to spread the classical reawakening throughout Europe. And he was very influential and helped inspire the neoclassic movement. Manx was a German painter. He worked in Italy, and he was a close friend of Johann Winckelmann. He was a painter for Cardinal Albini, and Cardinal Albini was actually a big sponsor of the classical revival and had a huge collection of antique sculpture, sarcophagi, vases, and things like that. The Cardinal is actually responsible for commissioning a lot of early neoclassic art, so he was fundamental in the expansion of the style, or spreading the style. In 1761, he commissioned a ceiling fresco in his villa, and it was called Parnassus, and it's considered the first true neoclassic painting. And it was a painting of the Olympian gods, and you can see that it was painted by Manx. It's a scene on Mount Parnassus, which is in central Greece, and the ancients believed that this mountain was sacred to Apollo and the 9 muses. Apollo stands in the center, and he holds a lyre and a laurel branch. He's the god of poetry, music, and the arts, and of course the sun too. The mother of the muses rests over here on a Doric column. The muses gather around practicing different various arts. And really the image is meant to be a celebration of the human mind and its ability to create. So it's celebrating the arts like writing, theater, poetry, song, dance, art, history, and astronomy. Manx was inspired by relief sculpture. He studied at Herculaneum. And Winckelmann described this piece as having a noble simplicity and calm grandeur, like those of the Greek originals. It's also a really good summary, a really good example of the early neoclassic style. Here's an example of a relief sculpture from Herculaneum. We're not really sure which relief sculpture he was looking at. We think maybe this could be one that he was looking at. It depicts Hercules and some musicians. There are some similarities. We have the similar male nude figure. Both wear drapery over their shoulders. Hercules wears a lion fur. Both are accompanied by musicians. And the movement of Hercules' musicians are similar to the muses dancing to the far left of Apollo. But we can tell that he really is looking at the style. So this might not be the exact one that he's looking at, but we can tell that he is really looking at this style. The central figure of Apollo refers to the Apollo that was found in the collection of the Vatican. So you can kind of see some similarities between these two, although it kind of looks like that he's flipped. Neoclassicism was very influential in architecture. In England, professional and wealthy amateur architects took a stance against Rococo architecture. So Neoclassicism became their response to the French Rococo architectural style. They believed that the Rococo style was immoral. And what was moral? So if that's immoral, what can we call moral? Well, they believed that the strict simplicity of Palladio was moral and acceptable. This is the Cheswick House in West London, and it was created from 1724 to 1729, and it was designed by its owner, Richard Boyle. Boyle visited Italy and he studied Palladio, and he was inspired by the Villa Rotunda. And just to kind of refresh your memory, here is what the Villa Rotunda looked like. We can see some obvious influences. They both have that Roman temple-like front. We have this geometric symmetry. They have similar elevation. But the Villa Rotunda actually has 4 entrances. So all of these these facades are entrance, but the Cheswick House only has 2 entrances. The Cheswick has an octagonal central core, whereas the villa has a round central core. The Cheswick lacks decoration. It lacks the sculpture that we can see here on the Villa Rotunda. It's just more simple looking. It's really just, frankly, it's like an English version of this Italian building. And of course, we know, living in the United States, that the neoclassical style was really a big deal in early American architecture. It was promoted by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a self-taught architect. He designed his home Monticello, which we see here up at the top, and also his retreat home Popular Forest, and the Virginia State Capitol, and the University of Virginia. So he designed all of those, and he really used a strong influence from the neoclassic style. He shared the British love of Palladio. His first version of Monticello was built in the 1770s, and it was based pretty precisely on Palladio's 4 books of architecture. But then he went to France, and he saw their elegant houses, and he decided that Monticello was too plain and too crude. So he completely redesigned it, and when he returned in 1793. Mostly what he did is he added the French doors and these tall, narrow windows, and he also added a concealed second story up here. So here's a comparison between Monticello and Cheswick House. First of all, it's not elevated. You can see how the Cheswick House is elevated. And it doesn't have this sort of square look to it. Instead, it's more horizontal. So this is a little bit more vertical. This is more horizontal. And really, by having this concealed second story, that's one of the ways that it makes it look more horizontal. Whereas this one, it has that very dominant dome there at the top. So it does make it look more vertical. This facade does look much more like a Roman temple than this does, but you can still see the strong influence there. So even though he redesigned it, it's really not 100% different than the ideas going on in England, and even going back to, Even going back to Palladio. And I just bring this in so you can see the Virginia State Capitol compared to a Roman-era temple in France from the 2nd century BCE. And you can see just how very similar they really are. This frontal entrance here, all the use of columns. This one uses Corinthian, this one uses Ionic, but still very similar. And of course, the Romans would have used Ionic, although that was a little bit more the practice of the Greeks. But very similar, has the pediment. So just very similar structures. So back in England, with the neoclassic style, English patrons didn't purchase works from English artists. Instead, they preferred to get history paintings from Italy, and they preferred to purchase these on their grand tour. The grand tour was when young men, usually young men, but also sometimes young women too, were educated by touring the major cultural cities in sites in southern Europe, especially Italy. They were accompanied by a tutor and servants. They usually began their tour in Paris, and the focus was to learn about classical and Renaissance pasts. The principal points of interest were Venice, Florence, Naples, and Rome. The practice of the grand tour began in the late 1600s and continued well into the 19th century. These students collected art, pieces like the one that we're looking at here, that would remind them of their trip. So the English liked to purchase their history paintings on their grand tours, or they could acquire paintings from agents. Angelica Kauffmann was one of the artists who painted in the neoclassical style. She was Swiss, and she trained in Italy. She was originally trained by her father and helped him on church murals. By the age of 15, she was accepting portrait commissions. She was introduced to the neoclassical style by Winkelmann himself, and she actually paints his portrait. In 1766, she was invited by one of her wealthy British clients to England, and that's how she ends up in England. There she meets Joshua Reynolds, and he introduces her to the classical style with the grand manner. But Kauffmann is really the one that brings neoclassicism, the style, to England.